In this video, we're taking a look at two of the most important elements of a real estate transaction, the deposit and the down payment. I'm going to break them both down for you, taking a look at what they are, when they're due, how much they are, and what are the main differences between the two. My name is Danielle Bondy-Sawyer with the Bondy-Sawyer real estate team here in the city of Toronto. If you want to see more of our videos, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Now, if you learn anything from this video or you find any value at all, please go ahead and hit that like button. It helps to push it out to other people like yourselves who might find it valuable as well. If you want to book a meeting with us to discuss a real estate move or just to chat about the market, you go ahead and do that in that first link down in the description. So I'm going to start by saying that in this video, we are talking strictly about resale transactions. If you're buying a pre-construction property from a builder, the deposit structure and deposit amounts are different than they are in resale, so that's going to be a subject for another video. So let's start with deposits. An offer to purchase real estate is made up of many important elements, some of which are arguably more important than others. In most cases, purchase price sits at the top of the list, followed by things like conditions, relevant clauses, closing date, inclusions, exclusions, and of course, one of the most important elements, the deposit. Simply put, the deposit is given by the buyer to the seller as a sign of good faith and to give the seller peace of mind that the person they're dealing with is qualified and serious. Think of it like a financial handshake. So when is the deposit due? Well, the pre-printed deposit section of an agreement of purchase and sale gives three options for when the deposit is to be paid: upon acceptance, herewith, or as otherwise described in this agreement. Upon acceptance means that the deposit is to be delivered to the deposit holder, typically the listing brokerage, within 24 hours of acceptance of the offer. Herewith is just as it sounds, with the deposit being provided with the offer. As otherwise described in the agreement can mean a few things. The buyer and seller might agree, for example, that the deposit be delivered in 48 hours as opposed to 24 hours. Or they might agree on an initial deposit plus subsequent additional deposits upon removal of conditions. For example, the buyer will submit $20,000 now and then an additional $10,000 when the financing condition is met. So how much should the deposit be? Well, in the Toronto market, 5% of the purchase price is typically a good rule of thumb, and that is likely the amount that the seller is going to expect to see. Having said that, I've seen deposits of less than 5%, often when it's a first-time buyer. And more than 5% is not out of the ordinary either. We see that often in multiple offer scenarios where buyers are trying to give themselves a leg up on the competition and make their offer as attractive as possible, sometimes submitting upwards of 10% of the purchase price. Where does the deposit go? Well, I mentioned earlier in the video that it typically goes to the listing brokerages. However, there are instances where the buyer and seller can agree to have it go to one of their lawyers or even to the buyer's realtor's brokerage. Either way, it sits in a trust account until closing, at which time it is dispersed accordingly. So when is the deposit refunded? Well, sometimes a deal is firm, meaning there are no conditions. Sometimes a deal is conditional. For example, conditional on the buyer arranging financing, or conditional on the buyer having a home inspection and being satisfied with the results of that home inspection. If the offer is conditional and any of the conditions are not met within the conditional period, then the deposit is typically refunded to the buyer in full without deduction. This, of course, depends on how the conditions are worded, but the typical wording stipulates that the buyer gets the deposit back. However, if the deal is firm, either from the outset or after the conditional period has ended, and the buyer subsequently tries to back out of that firm deal, then the seller might be entitled to keep the deposit. Assuming all goes smoothly, the deposit is ultimately applied to the purchase price of the property. So let's say you're buying $1 million property and your deposit is 5% of the purchase price, $50,000. That $50,000 is held in a trust account until closing, and it is then applied to the purchase price, along with the other $950,000. And that $950,000 is going to be made up of your mortgage, plus any additional funds that you have saved up to go towards the purchase above and beyond your deposit. And that brings us to down payment. Simply put, the down payment is all the money that the buyer pays up front, meaning it is their own money and it is not the mortgage, towards the purchase price of the property. In other words, it's the portion of the purchase price that is not financed. If you want to think of it like an equation, it would look something like this: purchase price minus mortgage amount equals down payment. For example, let's say you're buying $1 million property and you have managed to save up, aside from land transfer taxes, closing costs, etc., $300,000 to go towards that $1 million purchase price. That $300,000 is your down payment, and you'll be getting a mortgage for the other $700,000. So you're putting down 30% and you're borrowing 70%. Now here is where I'm going to tie together deposit and down payment. And here's where a lot of people seem to get tripped up about what the differences are between the two. Your deposit is actually part of your down payment. In our $1 million example, you're going to use $50,000 of that $300,000 down payment as your deposit. And this brings us to the question, when is the down payment due? The down payment is typically paid in two chunks. The first chunk is your deposit, which is at the beginning of the transaction, and your second chunk is the remainder of the down payment, which is paid at the end of the transaction when it closes. So using that $1 million example again, if you have a 30% down payment, so $300,000, you're going to give 5% as a deposit, $50,000 at the beginning of the transaction. And then on the closing of the transaction, you're going to give the other 25%, so $250,000, and then your $700,000 mortgage. So how much should your down payment be? Well, first I'll answer this question. Is there a maximum limit on how much your down payment can be? And the answer is technically no. You could pay for the property 100% in cash with no mortgage at all. Now, this of course is not common, but it is possible. The more relevant question for most buyers is going to be, is there a minimum requirement on down payments? And the answer to this one is yes, and these vary based on the purchase price. So let's break it down. On anything less than a $500,000 purchase price, you're required to put down a minimum of 5%. So on a $400,000 purchase price, for example, that's a minimum of $20,000. On a $500,000 purchase price, it would be a minimum of $25,000. If the purchase price is somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, you're required to put down a minimum of 5% on that portion below $500,000, and then another 10% on the remaining portion. So on a $600,000 purchase price, for example, you're putting down $25,000 on the first $500,000, and then another $10,000 on the remaining $100,000. So that would be a total of $35,000 down. And as soon as you hit $1 million, you're required to put a minimum of 20% down. And there's no sliding scale here. It's 20% down on the whole $1 million. So on a $1 million purchase, a minimum of $200,000 down. On a $1.2 million purchase, a minimum of $240,000 down. And one more thing to note here, if you're buying an investment property, so a second property, you are required to put a minimum of 20% down regardless of whether or not the purchase price is below $1 million. So what are the main differences between the two? Well, let's recap. The down payment is all of the upfront funds that the buyer is putting towards the purchase price, and the deposit is a portion of that down payment. The deposit is given at the very beginning of the transaction when the offer is first accepted as a sign of good faith and to reassure the seller. The remainder of the down payment is given at the end of the transaction on closing. The typical deposit in the Toronto real estate market is about 5% of the purchase price. Down payments, on the other hand, there are minimum requirements, and those minimum down payments vary based on purchase price. As always, thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. Next to me here is another video that you might find valuable, so just go ahead and click on that thumbnail and give it a watch. That's it for now, and we'll see you next time.